and this is still a work in progress, so I'm making this available mostly for beta testers, is some changes I'm making to MarcEdit, particularly around the work with Unicode, with the character encodings that aren't MARC8 and UTF-8. So this primarily comes up in European countries, and I've noticed it primarily with libraries that have been using Alma, and I'm not quite sure exactly if this is a default setting with Alma in European countries or not, but that library data traditionally in MARC 21 usually is output in either UTF-8 or in MARC-8. But I'm seeing more and more often that the base encoding is switching to ISO 8859-1. That's problematic in MarcEdit for a couple of reasons. Not that the data can't be processed, but that the diacritics, when mnemonic diacritics are created, are tied to MARC-8. So the diacritics generated for ISO 8859 would not be representative of the diacritics that are actually being translated to. As far as the user is concerned, as long as they don't change the mnemonics, the data will look the same once it goes in and out. But if you were going to create, you were going to use the mnemonics to actually insert diacritics, the diacritics wouldn't match the mnemonic value that you thought you were using, because MARC8 and ISO 8859 aren't the same thing. So this is somewhat problematic. And so what I've been doing is I've been trying to think about how I might be able to deal with this. And so I've added 2 new functions to MarcEdit. One of them is the use case is built around a library that does not use MARC8 as their primary base encoding, MARC8 or Unicode. So if I was a library and ISO 8859 was my base encoding, I have the option now to globally tell MarcEdit that this is my primary data encoding, and MarcEdit will then reconfigure the Marc engine so that translating data to XML and into Unicode from that base encoding becomes easier. So let me show you the 2 places where this has been implemented. The first place is globally. If you go to the Marc engine, you'll see a new option in the Unicode normalization set. It's an area where you can select character encoding. If you're a MARC8 or a UTF-8 coded user, you don't need to make any changes here because MarcEdit treats MARC8 and UTF-8 the same, essentially. Underneath it's translating data always into Unicode, so the MARC8 data is more for legacy formats. So you can leave it as that, and for most users they will. But let's say as a European user, I needed to use ISO 8859, I could select it here. You'll see that MarcEdit unchecks the use diacritics when breaking. This is important because without it, the diacritic mnemonics show up, and what we want to do is we want to actually get away from using the mnemonics. In the Marc editor, I can leave the default encoding as UTF-8, but if my primary encoding was something else, I would select it here. And then that reconfigures the Marc editor to use the data, to read the data correctly. If I don't change it here, there are other ways to still be able to make those changes. So I'm not going to make those changes. I want to show you something else. So the other place where this shows up is in the Marc tools. Previously, and this is why this is being done, I got this file from a user in Europe. They sent me a file from their national library because it wasn't translating right to Unicode. It's this file here. This is a file that's in ISO 8859. If I check to translate it to do Unicode without doing anything else and do the translation, you will see that the characters do not translate right. And that's because MARC8 and ISO 8859 aren't the same thing. They kind of look the same, but they aren't. And so when MarcEdit is trying to do the diacritic substitution, it's substituting diacritics assuming MARC8, and that's a problem here. So if I was a user, if I was a user today where my library primarily uses Unicode, I could take this data in, and then I have this new option, default character encoding. For this one process, I could change it to ISO 8859, click translate to UTF-8, execute, and now when I look at it, you will see that the diacritics have translated correctly. You'll also see up here that MarcEdit's showing you what encoding the data is showing up as. So in this case, it's UTF-8. This drop-down box, at least right now, only shows up when your data when your data encoding is different from either MarcEdit or UTF-8, or you've actually set the value in the default encoding. You changed it from either MarcEdit or UTF-8. So this way, you can see different encodings, and you could actually see what MarcEdit does. This is why it's important. If I select a different encoding, you'll see the diacritics don't render, and it's because MarcEdit is treating the data, the Unicode data, as ISO 8859, and it's not. You have to go back here. But what this does mean is if I'm a user who primarily does work with ISO 8859, I can edit my data and save it in that format. So I can execute. You'll see that MarcEdit's MarcEditor here shows that the data is being rendered in ISO 8859. You'll see the diacritics look good. Again, this is not Unicode data. If I switch this to UTF-8, you'll see the diacritics go away. This is specifically for ISO 8859. But if I was a user, and I do run across, this was something that I did find when I was visiting Europe earlier this year, is that the keyboard layouts sometimes are defined into this character encoding, and so for folks who save data in this format, this would be the appropriate way to work with their records. Just like in a library in the U.S., they would use either MarcEdit or UTF-8, and if you were using MarcEdit, you would work within MarcEdit's diacritics, the mnemonic diacritic format. This works for other character encodings too. So let's say I'm a Big 5 user. I can do the same thing. This is a Big 5 file. Drop it in here, tell MarcEdit that this file is a Big 5 file, execute it, edit the records, and you'll see the records show up in Chinese. Now this is not a Unicode data file, which is why I have up here something telling you it's not a Unicode file. If I selected Unicode data, you would see that it is not correct. But if I was a user and traditional Chinese, Big 5 was the data encoding that I actually wanted and was what my keyboard would output, I could make the change here and be able to work with it appropriately. One of the things I'm still working out, and this should work eventually, but right now I can show you that it's not, would be that second step process that you have here where you could say traditional Big 5 translate to UTF-8 without having to go through the initial step of using this tool first to translate the data to Unicode. If I execute it here and then look at it, one of the things you're going to see is the diacritics don't come out right, and I haven't quite figured out why that's the case. This tends to primarily only happen with Asian languages, and I'm not quite sure what the reasoning behind that is. The process that I'm using is the same as in the character conversion, so I'm going to dig a little more into that, and by the time this comes out of the beta testing, that should work, but just as a caveat, it's not right now. So anyways, that's the way that this is working. This change required touching a significant amount of the application. It required updating references to close to 1,000 different points within the Marc engine. I've actually recoded how the Marc engine creates objects of itself. They all live now in a specialized helper class that deals with property management, so that this, if I add new properties in the future, this doesn't require so much changing. But it is a significant change within the MarcEdit application, and since it does fundamentally change how the MarcEditor approaches and reads data, there will be a period of beta testing where I have a number of users who are high volume users that will be doing some testing and making sure that this works. These changes impact everything within the significant number of functionality elements within the MarcEdit GUI application. If the settings are set globally, it impacts every instance where you are working with Marc data or changing Marc data into XML or Unicode, if that's set globally in the global options, because the way that the Marc engine is now being generated, it will generate based on those global settings. If you work from the command line tool, there is a new command line flag where you can pass the encoding, and it's looking for a number, essentially a Windows code page number that translates roughly to the encoding that you're using as the base encoding for your data. So it's a significant change. There are many places where these changes will touch the application, and so I did want to make sure that we had a wind-up period so that folks had an opportunity to test and make sure that there were no adverse effects. So anyways, this is primarily, like I said, this is primarily for the beta testers, so that they get an opportunity to see what's been changed and how it should be working as they're doing their testing, but also as a heads up for other people as they wait for these new changes to come forward.